This is the second in a series of events that is being sponsored by the Graduate Student Council on career options in industry. So today we have three panelists who are going to join us from the consulting industry. All of them are alums from MIT who received their PhD here. So currently we only have two because there is one who just landed at 5:15 and is on his way here as we speak. And then the fourth panelist unfortunately had to cancel at the last minute because of a client meeting that came up out of town, which should give you guys a taste of what it's like to be a consultant and how unpredictable your schedule can be sometimes. So the format of the panel is going to start with just some questions from the moderator, and then will be opened up shortly thereafter to questions from the audience, and will last around 60 to 90 minutes. At the very end, depending on the time availability of our panelists, you guys can come down and have a little meet and greet and ask them any questions that you may have that weren't answered during the panel discussion. So with that, why don't we open and just have the panelists introduce themselves and talk about their link to MIT and what they've done since graduating.
I'll start. My name is Sean Wu. I graduated in June 2011. Was in biological engineering, worked with Doug Laufenberger as my thesis advisor. And so I've been away for about a couple of years, and in that time have basically went straight to consulting. I've been doing consulting for the last 2 years with a firm called Clarion Healthcare. We're one of these boutique life science firms in the Boston area. We're right downtown at South Station, about 35 people. And it's been a great experience, and happy to share what the last 2 years have been like.
Great. So hi everyone, my name is Nick Marcantonio. So actually Sean and I were sitting in the same office in the biological engineering department. So I'm also a BE grad. I finished up here in June of 2008. And after finishing here, I joined ClearView Healthcare Partners, which, like Clarion, is also a boutique life science focused strategy consulting firm. When I joined ClearView, it was basically brand new. So I think I interviewed, there were about 4 people there. Joined as a consultant, have been there now for 5+ years. So I'm currently a senior engagement manager with the organization. And right now we're about 50 or so people. And we're located a little bit of a different direction, right in Newton, Massachusetts. So if any of you guys know the hotel that sits over the pike, we're basically right there. So also very close to MIT. So, and also excited to be here and talk about the last couple of years.
All right, so why don't we start just by talking a little bit about what prompted you to explore a career in business?
Sure, I'll start. So if I think about why I went to grad school in the first place, so unlike some other folks, I knew I always wanted to go into industry. So academia was never really on my radar as sort of a long-term career. And for me, I also always knew I wanted to be in the life sciences, so pharmaceuticals, biotech. And for me, so one of the reasons for getting a PhD was because I felt like in that industry, unlike a lot of other industries, the PhD is sort of a necessary requirement to be someone who's not just doing research, but is making decisions about research and decisions about innovation. So where should we be innovating, in terms of developing new drugs and new therapies? And that was always my goal. And to be honest, the idea of making decisions and directing research, as it turns out, I found more exciting than actually doing the lab work itself. I think when I started at MIT, I always assumed the way to get to that position is basically you start in the lab, you work your way up, you lead a group, and eventually you get to a little bit more of that managerial role. And I think that still is true in a lot of ways in R&D. And in fact, my wife is actually a discovery scientist at Merrimack Pharmaceuticals, and so I get to see that sort of in practice. But when I got to MIT, that was the first time I was really exposed to thinking about consulting. And as probably many of you guys know, I think the first introduction for most people is BCG, McKinsey, the big well-known generalist management consulting firms. That was also how I got to know about consulting. I had friends who were going that route. And there were some really great things that I thought were enticing about consulting, but I was also looking for something that was a little bit of a smaller feel, life science focused, and I wasn't ready to sort of go into that travel model, so I was a little bit concerned about being on the road all the time. And so as part of that, I started to through talking to people, through doing sort of my own research, found out that there is this concept of boutique life science consulting. And when I started to do my research around it and talk to people, it seemed like it was a way to do what I always wanted to do, which was help to influence and make decisions about where and how to innovate without having to work my way up sort of the ladder in industry. I think one of the other things that, if I think back, as a scientist who didn't really have familiarity with business, you sort of assume it's the science that always dictates where you go. But obviously, when once I think you get further into your career in grad school, or if you start to work in industry, you realize it's not just the science. It's where there's medical need. It's where there's a commercial opportunity and many other things that feed into that. And so when I learned about it, I felt like this gave me a great opportunity to help work with companies who make decisions about innovating without having to be at the bench. And that was what was really exciting to me about consulting. And so through going to panels like this and talking to people, that's ultimately what led me to make a decision to go into consulting.
I took a pretty roundabout path to consulting. I actually started out in consulting where right before the summer before my senior year in college, I did an internship with Bain & Company and thought, oh wow, this is an amazing experience. I really feel connected with the work that I'm doing, but I'd always wanted to go to grad school. I shouldn't be so fickle. I should just go and get a PhD. So when I came to MIT for the PhD program, I've written off consulting pretty much forever, thinking I been there, done that, I made that decision, and I'm not going to go back to it. But throughout the course of the PhD, a lot of what Nick is saying definitely resonated, feeling that my research, while important, I didn't feel the immediate impact and immediate connection with the impact that my work was doing. Publish a paper, go to a conference, have very exciting scientific conversations, but ultimately I wouldn't get to see that product come to market or even that research be used in a product to come to market until much later stage. So I looked at a lot of different things, and again, I was had written off consulting at this point. I tried science policy, I tried science education, went to Beijing through the MISTI China program for 6 months to work at one of the UN agencies actually in climate change policy, which was an amazing experience, but through that I realized not only do I want to have impact, but I also wanted to be in certain environments, and it could have just been that specific experience. I did a couple internships in the Boston area too in healthcare policy, but having that impact, it's not just, it's beyond impact, it's also having a shorter time scale of feeling that impact. And so it's not about doing research and having it 5 years later be the stepping stone to someone else's innovative research to then be a product in 10 years, or in the science policy world, writing a research paper or a policy analysis and have that be the white paper that someone refers to. I wanted to feel that immediate impact on a shorter time scale. And then on the science education side, I wasn't sure that I was completely committed to a career in education. So a friend and I actually talked a lot about doing teaching focused. So instead of a tenure track position at a research university, going to smaller liberal arts universities where you're completely focused on undergraduate education. So we had a lot of conversations about that, and ultimately I just didn't feel like I could make that leap and say, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. And came back, I actually started thinking about consulting again because of the life science-ness and the boutique-ness of some of the firms in Boston. And you might feel like Nick and I both are representing the life sciences a little bit here, but I think the general principle of consulting definitely applies more broadly. And the things that attracted me to it ultimately is feeling immediate impact from the work that I do. So every day we're working on something, interacting with clients on a much shorter time scale. So at the end of a 8 to 10 week project, we could be working with the same client repeatedly, but at the end of that project, there's a very satisfying conclusion of here's our deliverable, here's our recommendation, here are the specific action steps 1, 2, and 3 that you as a client need to do to better build your business. And so all of that sort of came together. And the other part of consulting was I really wanted a teamwork environment. At the end of the day, research felt really lonely. And we had a big lab, and so we had fun, friendly lab mates, and it was very collaborative. But my thesis project at the end of the day was my thesis. Nick wasn't going to work on my thesis for me as much as I might have wanted him to. And that shared responsibility and that shared collaboration to come up with the best idea possible, not just the way that I think, but what I started that Nick then thinks about, that someone else then thinks about, and it's really a conglomerate of iterations of good ideas that make them the best ideas, and that team-like environment was something that I thought I would be able to find in consulting, and ultimately came back and only applied to life science consulting firms, also because I wanted to focus on on what I got my degree in. But that's, I think, a lot of the same principles, as I mentioned, apply to general consulting as well.
So can you describe a typical week in consulting, if there is a typical week, and maybe contrast it to what it was like when you were in grad school?
Yeah, it changes. It depends on where you are. I would say my first year, the typical week is different than my typical week here. And when you start, and I think in any firm, your initial role is typically fairly content heavy and research heavy. So in healthcare, you might be assigned one disease area or Medicare to really understand how Medicare policies might affect the commercial attractiveness of a specific product. So, over the course of the week, it's you spend a couple of hours going down a path of looking at a few Medicare-related, segmentations, and then come back to your team and say, well, this is what I found, and your team members might say, oh, well, actually, that raises another question. And so it's a little bit of work on your own, and then go talk to someone, work on your own some more, go talk to someone. And as your role evolves, and every firm is different, you start to have more client interactions, as well as you're now the one that someone comes to you to talk about what there is additional questions on. Contrasted to how grad school was, I mean, the schedule is not as flexible. I'm at my desk by 8:30 every morning, as opposed to grad school when I was waking up very late, maybe, and getting in lab in time to eat lunch, and then staying really, really late at night. And so that whole flexibility of schedule has changed, but ultimately it's still about asking questions. It's just in a different field, asking the right questions. And I always tell people, every answer that you get should pose 3 more questions at least, and that's the same in the research world that we do as well, which is also why consulting firms like to hire PhDs, because we've gone through that rigorous analytical training to know what questions are actually posed by answers that we've found, and over time you gain more and more responsibilities in terms of leading a team, leading a project, again influencing client opinions and client thought, and so probably a lot more interpersonal interactions over the course of a day that are more formalized and professional, rather than talking about baseball with your lab mate who's sitting next to you.
Yeah, so I think so I'd agree with everything Sean said, and to build on that, I do think the nature of your day or your week changes based on where you are in a project. And I think it's important to recognize that in consulting, the way the model works in not all cases, but in many cases, is we basically have clients who sign on basically to, they buy a project from us. And that project has typically a defined set of objectives that you need to meet in a given time frame. And again, different consulting firms have different models in terms of how that works, but roughly I think it's a reasonable way to think about things. And therefore, in the beginning of a project, I think a lot of it is around framing the project, understanding exactly what your client needs, what they care about, making sure that you and your client are aligned on how you're going to get there. And I'm sure many of you guys are familiar, with consulting. In a lot of ways, we always think about it first and foremost as problem solving, But I would take it one step further. It's not only problem solving, but it's basically delivering whatever your client needs of you. And that goes hand in hand with the problem solving. So I think about that as being an important first step in a project. Once you have that alignment, you have an approach, you have a framework, it's then actually doing the research and the analysis. And then finally, once that's happened, it orients more in terms of building your deliverable, the actual output from the work, which in most cases, it's building the presentation, that sort of reporting your findings. It's not even reporting your findings, but it's the communication tool that talks about the story in terms of how you've figured out what they wanted and gotten them to the right answer. So it's not just here's the answer, it's here's the answer and here's how we got there. And so I think your day or your week changes based on where you are in that project. So early on, there's more internal communication, thinking through a framework, making sure you know how you're going to do that research and analysis. And for a lot of the work that Sean and I do, a lot of the research, in addition to doing secondary research, it's talking to physicians, it's talking to the people who make decisions at insurance companies. So, market research, so to speak, but it's even more than that. And so when you get into that phase of the work, there's, time or in the day goes to actually doing those interviews and sort of doing the supporting work that goes with it. But when you get into that process then, as Sean pointed out, there's the research component, there's the internal communication that's going on. So there's the meetings with the rest of your team. Then there's also the meetings with the client. So reporting out what are we learning, what are the things that we should be thinking about for the next step of the work, helping them to understand where we are in the research and analysis, before then you transition to focusing more on actually creating your deliverables, the slides, the model, what the Word document that goes hand in hand with that, whatever it may be. And so over the course of your project, where you might have at some parts, more research, then it becomes more about actually finishing the analysis, creating the deliverable. So, but at any one week, you're going to have a mix of that. So there's a lot of communication, there's research, there's problem solving, and then there's the client communication that goes hand in hand with all of that.
All right, why don't we open it up to questions now from the audience? Does anyone have anything they'd like to ask the panelists? If not, I have many questions I can ask.
So we have a few.
Okay, cool.
So what are the things that you really don't like working in a consultancy?
That's a loaded question. At least in my experience, I think one thing is probably not a surprise to most of you who have looked into consulting. I think in most cases, consulting isn't a 9-to-5 job. And I think, the example of one of the panelists who isn't here because of a client meeting, I think is a good example of that. So that's a very big difference from grad school where, Sean talked about you're working for yourself. When you get into consulting, you're working for a client, and in most cases, it's, you have to do whatever it takes to sort of meet the needs of the client. So, it's not a 9-to-5 job. It ends up being, you have to be willing to, in a lot of cases, make your schedule fit the needs of the client and the project. And, in my mind, that's the one, if I had to talk about a drawback in consulting, it's just generally more hours. So, and honestly, that to me is, when people ask about a drawback, the biggest thing, because, there's trade-offs that go hand in hand with it, right? I think it's a very exciting and engaging job. So I also think it's, to be upfront, it's a well-compensated industry. So it's a combination of those trade-offs, because again, there are opportunities for consultants to move into positions that are 9-to-5 jobs in industry, but it's a trade-off for the other things that go hand in hand with it. So I want to be careful saying what I don't like most about it, but I sort of joke, you can have perfect work-life balance, make a lot of money, and have something really exciting, but you have to pick two of those. So it's not totally true, but I do think it's always that balance. And if there's one thing in an ideal world that I would change, I'd love to have a few more hours in the day. But again, I'm still doing this because I like what I'm doing, and I think that's why I'm willing to make that trade-off.
And this might be a cop-out answer, but it's more of a challenge, especially for PhDs, rather than something that I actively dislike. It's actually made consulting quite fun, but something that a lot of PhDs and scientists struggle with in consulting is ambiguity. And so we're constantly being, as Nick explained, we're engaged by our clients, we're doing a project, and there's a pretty determinate timeline to that. And at the end of the project, we need to make a recommendation. So there's always a feeling of the incompleteness of information. And in the face of that, you still have to pull out the rigorous analysis and have the data to back up your conclusions and your recommendations. And it can feel very uncomfortable initially to say, well, I would say X, Y, and Z if I knew A, B, and C, but you don't have A, B, and C. You still have to say X, Y, and Z because the client is needing that recommendation. And so it's something that is definitely a challenge, especially coming from the science world, where we are aimed at pursuing truth. We want to find out 100% of the truth, and in consulting, a lot of times the 80-20 rule definitely applies. You get 80%, you can spend a lot more time and get the last 20%, but you just take a step back and say, what is the big picture here? What is the value of actually getting that extra 20% versus the time that I need to put into it? And can I make an educated guess? I'm not going to lie, and I'll talk about all the assumptions that I've made in the meantime, but being able to take that step is actually pretty difficult coming from the science world where we want everything to be as deterministic and empirical as possible.
So I have I guess a few questions about projects. How many you generally have at a time, how the typical duration, and then also how much say you have in the projects that you're put on.
Sure. So I'll start with that. So I do think that will vary by consulting firm, by the type of consulting that you're doing. For the work that we do, I'd say our projects are typically on the order of 8 to 10 weeks in length, but there's a lot of variability. So there's sometimes you're going to be on a due diligence where you need to give your client an answer in 2 or 3 weeks. There are other times you might be on a much bigger project, a long-term strategy project that will be 3 months or 4 months. So it does vary, but our typical is about that 8 to 10 weeks, give or take. Different companies have different models in terms of how they staff. So at our company, it's a single staffing model for consultants. So you will typically be staffed on one project at a time. So over the course of a year, you'll see about 6 projects, give or take. But again, that's very specific to what we do and the nature of the type of consulting that you'll be able to dictate how that works.
I would say that's similar for us, but not surprising given we're similar firms. We do sometimes also double staff, especially for more senior associates and consultants, and you're splitting your time between 2 different projects, but that would be the only difference from what Nick said.
Dr. Weinberg, if you want to just briefly introduce yourself, and then I think that the last question was about the nature of the projects you typically have on a consulting case, and then the length of the project as well.
Sure. So Eli Weinberg, I don't think anybody calls me doctor, but I was MIT Course 2 undergrad through PhD. Haven't been back here in a while. We have not gotten any better at numbering our buildings or room numbers, but apologies for being late. What was the first question? Oh, McKinsey and Company.
Yes.
So I personally work primarily in healthcare, a little bit of healthcare reform and a lot of medical product development related work. Commercialization of new products and marketing of those products, that sort of thing.
Awesome. Thanks.
So if I could just...
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, if you wouldn't mind addressing my question about the how you're assigned to projects, especially within McKinsey where you have a variety of different areas that you cover. How are those projects assigned, and how much does someone new coming in have a say in what they would be working on?
Sure. So it's a dating game. There are always new projects coming in, and there are always consultants coming available. So our model, and I should have mentioned I worked at Monitor Group previously, had a similar model where there's an allocator, and that allocator may be dedicated to people of a certain tenure, or I personally have an allocator who's dedicated to healthcare, And so that is the person who kind of acts as the nexus, sees all of the projects that are available, tries to stay in touch with the needs of the clients, and then also have an understanding of what sort of work you're interested in. There are a lot of things to balance, so what the client needs, where you are in your tenure, so making sure you're getting an opportunity to develop, making sure you're getting an opportunity to do things that you like. You're working with new people, but you're also working with people that you like, so balancing all of those things. There's an official person who does that, and then there's the unofficial channel where most things happen, which you work with a partner that you like, and a couple months later you become available and you run into them and say, hey, what's going on? And, oh, interesting, let's try to make that work. So, you know, there's I think most companies have the official channel that all of the paperwork gets done in, and then, you know, like so much of consulting, the way that you actually get on a project is very relationship-based.
Great, thank you.
And I'd say, just to sort of provide a little bit of adjacent perspective, I think it's a little bit different for smaller companies like ours, simply because if you think about the turnover coming on and off of a project, we simply have a smaller pool of people who are turning over, and obviously less projects going on at one time. So it's a similar process, but I'd say obviously there's a little bit less of there's less sort of direct optionality, I would say, simply because we're not going to have 10 people in a company of 50 free up, you know, every week or so. So I think the approach it's similar in that there is still someone who's sort of, allocator or staffing, however you want to call it, who's sort of responsible for that. But I think there's a little bit more of an active management of that from the senior leadership at the company, those of us who are team leaders, in terms of talking about, you know, for the people in the company, what are their professional development needs? So we have basically 4 partners at the company, so it's giving them an opportunity to work with all the different partners to see, you know, they all have slightly different styles. So even though they work in the same space, different client set, different styles. So it's a little bit different, but designed to make sure that folks have an opportunity to see the whole spectrum of the types of projects that we sell and the whole spectrum of clients that we work with.
Great, thanks.
I would just add, geography is also a consideration that comes in a lot of times. So whether you're willing to travel, how much you're willing to travel, those sorts of things.
Awesome. Yeah, right here.
Consulting hires a lot of MBAs. How well equipped are PhD students compared to MBAs in solving the problems that you face?
So I think that's another question that's going to vary a lot by the type of consulting that you do and the type of company that you're looking at. So at ClearView, we hire PhDs, MBAs, and MDs all at the same level, so all at what we call the consultant level. The names change company to company, consultant, associate, but in general it's the same set of principles. So for us, for the type of work that we do, you know, we actually have many more PhDs than we have MBAs. And in fact, a number of the folks with MBAs had PhDs first and got their MBAs along the way. So for the type of work that we do, we find that, again, we're life science focused, so everyone in our company has a life science background because we're so focused on that. So even with the MBAs we hire, we're looking for folks who have some sort of science training or work in industry. So as a result of that, we happen to have many more PhDs than MBAs, but again, very different at different consulting firms.
I can speak for my firm. So we similarly hire a mix of MDs and PhDs and MBAs and other backgrounds. The expectation is PhDs are a little less prepared, so you get more training. The sum total more training you get is 3 weeks, and it's called their mini MBA, and after that you're expected to perform essentially at the same level as MBAs. Historically, PhDs and MDs have, in their first year, year and a half, maybe 2 years, taken on responsibility less quickly than MBAs, and then after that outperformed. There's a lot of, I think I'm safe in saying to an MIT audience, you can't teach smart. So you can teach a lot of other things, and so, you know, people like you who are in this room have the brain power necessary, most likely.
And also at a small firm, the one bad egg can actually have a pretty long-lasting effect. And so from the Clarion perspective, we actually don't hire MBAs. And we were just talking about whether or not to go to a panel at HBS. And I had this conversation today with one of our partners, and he said, you know, it'd be a great way to dip our toe into that pool, but I'm just not sure if we want to be hiring HBS MBAs. And because we had a couple of bad experiences with just 2 individuals. So the partners, even though they themselves have MBAs, have been a little reluctant to go recruiting down that path. And so the only MBAs we have at Clarion are who come from industry. And so they've either worked in pharma, worked in biotech, and have that MBA and have that really solid knowledge on the life science side. And exactly, you can't teach smart, but we've also found that it's been hard to teach the MBAs the science side of things, where it's a lot easier to teach the PhDs the business side.
At your firms, who are your main, like what does a typical case look like? Who are your main clients? What questions are they asking?
So, I mean, I think that's the $1 million question. And, you know, I sort of joke that consulting doesn't mean anything until you start to put the modifiers on it. So what industry are you in? What type of consulting are you? Are you strategy? Are you operational? Are you technical consulting? So it is really broad. And again, it depends completely on the company that you're looking at. So for the type of work that we do, so again, we're strategy focused for the life sciences. So our work is primarily focused on pharma, biotech, to a lesser extent, devices and diagnostics. So we work mostly with big pharma and mid-cap pharma. So you would know, the lion's share of the companies that we work with. And we help them with any or all questions related to innovation and growth strategy. So it's making decisions about where to innovate, how to execute on that to basically bring new therapies to market. And again, there's a lot, there's a lot of different specifics. You can focus on a single drug, you can focus on a disease area. So, that's still a very broad set of things that you can be focused on, but I'd say that in a nutshell is the type of work that our company does.
We do a bit of everything. So represented across all of the geographies in the world. A lot of industries that I didn't know existed until I got to McKinsey. We work with governments, we work with Gates Foundation sort of places. We certainly work with commercial organizations. I think one thing that you'll see is we very rarely work with small companies, just by nature of, that's sort of how consulting goes. But other than that, we work with pretty much everybody.
And I think Clarion would maybe be a little bit of the exception. We don't work with too many small companies, and even the small companies that we do work with are not too small. If you think of a 4-person startup, they're not running out to hire consultants anytime soon. But we have worked with early stage companies in thinking about how they might be a group of scientists and they haven't really thought about the commercialization side of that science. So we will work with that, looking at different trends in industry, so to help smaller companies with actually their investor decks to go out and get investment funding, VC funding. So I would say for Clarion, it's about 25% of our client mix are startup biotechs in the, not too big, 100 to 500 million revenue size, or even earlier without a product on the market.
I would just say, though, for you guys who are interested in consulting or are thinking about it, I do think that is one of the most important questions. So I think, McKinsey, BCG being very well known, again, do a bit of everything. If you're thinking about something that's smaller, more boutique, I think it's really important to actually understand exactly what those companies are doing. So I found out, that you can say life science consulting, and you think you know exactly, or at least you think you have an idea of what that is. And what I found out is when I got into the interview process, every company is a little bit different. So there are some companies that focus on pricing and reimbursement. There are some companies that focus more on a post-launch as opposed to a pre-launch type of consulting model. And this is the life sciences, but I imagine the same thing applies if you start looking at different industries as well that are a little bit more focused. So I think it's really important to actually talk to people, meet people at the company to learn exactly what they do, because again, it can be much broader than you would expect just by looking at the website or sort of reading about it ahead of time.
So how big are the teams you work in, and what does failure look like when a project fails?
Answer the first part first. Give us a second to think about the second one. So it can vary. The size of the team can vary. The smallest will be, so there's always a partner involved. The partner is always the connection to the client who is talking about what their problems are and what they need to solve and what they need help on. Beyond that, it can vary from literally one consultant up to we'll do projects that have 30 consultants on the ground. And there are companies that do sort of implementation-focused work that will have 100 consultants on the ground, which sounds crazy, but and it is crazy, and 30 is crazy, and kind of, but it can vary. I think the typical thing that you'll see is something like a partner, another partner floating around, an associate partner, and these titles vary from firm to firm, but then you'll have 1, 2, or 3 project managers, and the project manager will have under them 1 or 2 consultants. And that's the big bulk of what we do, at least. There, we had the second part of the question. So, I mean, there's two kinds of failure. There's failure for your client, and there's failure for your company. So a lot of times consulting firms get swapped in and out of our clients, and so that can be viewed as a failure from the consulting perspective. And there's always the pressure when we go and give presentations. Don't offend anybody. We're just consultants here. We can get kicked out. That doesn't happen that often. And then the failure from the client side is very often we come in with very we're brought in when our clients have problems, and it's often very clear whether or not we've solved the problem.
So maybe just talk for a moment first about team size again. So structure is relatively similar, but a smaller scope. Same sort of concept, partner on every project. I'd say our teams will vary between 1 person with that partner up to maybe 4. So manager, and then 2 or 3 people with that, consultants and analysts. But again, it does vary based on the size of the project. So the typical project probably for us has about 3 or 4 people, about 3 people plus a partner. Again, in a company of about 50, that sort of is a reason we don't have 30 people on a project at a time. In terms of failure, I guess if I think about the business model for consulting, it's to sell more projects. It's to have your clients come back to you. So I would define failure as your client is unhappy with the work and doesn't want to work with you again. And so I think for any of us who are up here, that happens incredibly rarely, because otherwise we wouldn't be here today. That's fundamentally what drives the business of a consulting firm.
I think the team structure has been covered pretty well, so I'll give another example of potential failure in that at the end of the day, we're strategy consultants. We come in with a recommendation with a set of actions, and it's up to our clients whether or not they actually follow through with that. And so one of the areas of failure is also on the client side, where the organization is just not in a place to accept the kinds of recommendations that we're given, and the direct client who we're working with in whatever function on the client side may agree with us, but they have a really hard time selling that thought, selling that strategy to the rest of the organization, and that can sometimes be frustrating. We've been on a couple of projects where the client would come back and say, we really thought this product would be great, this asset would be great, and our business development people were on board to go out and try to have conversations to acquire this asset, but ultimately the CEO just didn't think this was the right therapeutic therapeutic area to go in, and there's nothing you can do in that situation. You think, wow, all that work, this really would have been wonderful if our client could have followed through, but it's somewhat the decision is out of our hands as the consultants, and that can be a frustrating aspect of consulting sometimes.
So, for those of us that are still considering doing a postdoc, do you guys know what would be, how would it affect the likelihood, positively, negatively, not at all, of being hired as a consultant if you do have a postdoc preparation or whatever?
Yeah. For Clarion, we don't treat that too differently unless you've been at a postdoc for 5 or 6 years, and then we just wonder why the sudden change in direction of career. What made you so interested in academia before that you've stayed in a postdoc for as long, and now decided to completely do something different. It feels more understandable coming out of a PhD. You're exploring, had a chance over a course of 5 to 6, 7, 8 years to figure out what you might want to do, and then when you go down that path to a postdoc, it's almost assumption that you're starting to go down the academic path. And so there probably is a length of time at a postdoc at which there's not really an easy point of return, and maybe a couple of years. And so a year in, it makes you can still make a good case for it. And as long as you can make a good case in any interview or conversations with consulting firms, and that we believe your story is genuine, I don't think there's a big difference between having just a PhD versus having done a postdoc.
Yeah, I did a postdoc. Not much of a difference. I would say it is what you make of it. So things that we look for are things like thought leadership. So if you did a postdoc and you were helping start a lab and you knocked out a bunch of interesting publications, then that's a lot different from doing a postdoc where you just did the faux doc and continued your graduate studies.
Yeah, I think I agree with both points. I do think even with someone who's been a postdoc for 2 years, we would just try to understand why the switch. So, because I think in a lot of cases, but not everyone, people will know a couple years into their graduate program whether or not if they want to do either research or academia long term. So I don't think there's anything direct, there's no penalty, but I do think you have to be prepared to answer that question as part of the interview process.
One challenge you may have is I know we have academic programs that are specifically built around the academic calendar and we do PhD recruiting, we don't do postdoc recruiting. I don't think that would be an enormous change, but you would have to make sure that you're in touch with whoever the campus recruiters are.
Right, so this is to help probably those of us still on the borderline deciding whether we should go down the path of academia or perhaps to look elsewhere in industry or consulting. So if you can kind of like do a bit of comparison for us, the workload, the stress in academia, the main drive is either publish or perish. So you are stressed out, that you come in daytime, trying to develop experiments, got a lot of data, you go out, trying to write many papers and publish them, you're trying to write grant applications, and somewhat, if you get in, you're not quite trained as managers, but you have to start opening a lab, employ, technicians, postdocs, other people to work under you, and then maybe some down the line you worry about tenure track position coming in, whether you're going to get tenure or you're going to get tenure, all those stress, and whether you can still maintain your grants. How does that compare with, and then you have some more idea of the time scale of making to assistant, associate, and publish full professorship, if that's a route. How does that compare with the number of clients delivering the product, the time scale of going through the runs, and the workload, how much workload you bring home in terms of balancing all that are probably comparing to the academic track, perhaps. And then that's the first question. The second one, if you could share some light on, the most important question, the salary comparison, probably once you pass assistant professor, maybe 100K plus at this stage, maybe how do you compare the income, to justify that is a good point of going one way or the other, perhaps.
So I'll start with the first one. They're both hard. So I think, so having not been someone who went through a postdoc or was aiming for academia, it's hard for me to say one is harder, more stressful than the other. I think it's just the nature of the deadlines and the type of stress is different. So I think for me, one of the biggest changes in going from grad school to consulting is you're working under much tighter deadlines. This goes back to something Sean talked about before, where, as a grad student in many labs, you can take as much time as you need to figure out every little detail and get to the right answer, and you can't do that. So to me, I think that is a big adjustment, is being able to work under much tighter deadlines, because in 99% of the cases, they're not flexible. And if you don't hit that deadline, that is failure. So there is no option in terms of changing the time scale if you dig into something and it seems harder or more complex than it would be. So I think it's a different type of stress. The other part that goes hand in hand with it is, I think it's different to work for someone else relative to yourself. So, at least in my experience, I feel like it puts an almost higher burden on things when, it's not just you have something at stake, and it's not just your company has something at stake, but your client who's hired you also has something at stake. So again, that's not to discount what you would go through in part of academia, it's just different. So, in my mind, I don't think you can say one is any more stressful. It partly depends on, for each of you, what's the type of stress, so to speak, that fits best your personality.
Yep, agree with all that. I think one thing that's very different between academia and consulting was, as you point out, publish or perish, is not very tightly linked to how good of a scientist you are, which was frustrating to me. In consulting, your career progression is very tightly linked to how successful you are as a consultant. So the evaluation process is very transparent. You'll get feedback on kind of a week-to-week basis on how you're doing. And if you're doing well, you'll be successful. You don't have to do well and publish that you're doing well. You just sort of do your job. So that to me is an attractive thing about it. The downside is you asked about the stress. Everybody you're working with is also being evaluated. The turnover rate in consulting, I don't know if we've mentioned this, is very high. So most people stick around for, at least I can speak for McKinsey, maybe 80% leave after 2 or 3 years. And so some of that is because they don't like consulting. Some of it is because they have not performed as well as the people who are staying around. There are a lot of other differences, but go ahead.
And I want to touch on another point that you mentioned, how much work do you take home with you? And I want to point back to when I first started consulting, so I was very junior, had topics assigned to me, do this, do that, and I did it, I sent it off, emailed it at the end of the day, and then I went home and watched TV. That lasted for a very, very short time, and I think ultimately, and I said this to someone else recently, the type of people that we are for having gone through a PhD and being excited and challenged by the types of problems that are interesting, we ultimately take home work with us, whether or not intentionally or not. And at the end of the day, I hope that you are thinking about the work that you're supposed to be doing during the day when you're also at home. And downtime, I'm watching TV and something sparks my interest. Just because we're passionate about the work that we are doing and it's challenging and it's interesting, you can't help but think about those elements of actually work, and I think that's okay. I don't see that as taking work home. I don't let it take over my life. I'm not at the office 90 hours a week, but there is an element of I'm constantly sort of the wheels are turning. I'm thinking about the work, be it one topic or another, and that's something that when I first came out of grad school, I felt really relieved by. I can leave my work at work and go home and not really think about it. But very quickly realized if I'm actually interested in something, if it's something that I want to do, I should want to at least be thinking about it informally or in between things, even while I'm not physically at work.
maybe one other thing that's worth mentioning, I remember being stunned when I started consulting, is the amount of time you spend interacting with other people and planning how you're going to interact with other people. And if you're the type of person who has sat through other classes and never raised your hand, consulting may be a challenge for you. If you're the kind of person who, through your research, has really enjoyed connecting with people in other research groups and connecting with your group and building teams and succeeding that way, that's a lot of what we do in consulting. But there's not much of consulting where you kind of get tired of dealing with people and go to your lab for a couple of days and come back. It's sort of, you'll be meeting with either people on your team or clients or people on other teams, every hour, every other hour.
And I think there was a second part of the question around compensation, and I don't want to get into the details of that. I think in terms of numbers, there's plenty of information online that you guys can sort of dig into and understand the different companies. I do think it's fair to say, for a lot of the reasons we've talked about, consulting is not easy, the same way academia is not easy. And I do think you are compensated accordingly for a job that's hard, and the longer you're there, the more upside there is. So there is a lot of financial upside, to be a partner at a successful consulting firm. I think there's the upside is part of what goes hand in hand with consulting. It's not necessarily just what the starting point is, but the trajectory is higher than it is in, let's say, more of a traditional industry position. To compare it to academia, I don't know if it's an appropriate comparison, because if you think about, the successful professors at MIT, at Harvard, it's not just, being a professor, but it's all the innovation that goes hand in hand with it. If you think about how many companies people have founded, the way they consult for different firms. So, it's hard to make sort of a direct comparison, because I think, in both cases, there's an aspect of, how long you've been doing it and what you make of it.
Yeah, in the back.
So how did you prepare for the interview process, and how did you make the case for being hired after PhD?
You're looking at me, I don't know. So I've gone through it twice now. I would say, in terms of the interview process, practice, practice, practice. So it's not like any interview, at least in a lot of the companies you're probably familiar with case-based interviews or something along those lines, where it's a very artificial situation. It's not just about who you are and your history and a resume read. It's digging in on kind of your problem-solving skills. You need to practice that to be prepared. So you can work with friends. You can find people who are at firms who can give you pointers, those sorts of things. And you should definitely reach out to people at the firms you're interested in and find out what those firms are looking for. And it's a little bit of marketing. You have to be honest about who you are, but to the extent that you can show the traits that a company is looking for, and to the extent that you can identify things about that company that make you a particularly good fit. The only way to do that is by talking to the people who are working there.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think, to reference some of the things we've talked about, so, the case, for those of you guys who aren't familiar, it's, one of the tools that companies use to gauge how smart you are. So you're put in, again, it is an artificial situation, but it's a problem-solving exercise. And every consulting firm does that. They might do it in different ways, but that is something that you have to get used to. But I do think there is an aspect of practice. So even if you're smart, there's a rhythm and there's a format to a degree to the way cases are sort of run as part of the interview process. So practicing, getting familiar and comfortable with that is a huge component, because even if you're a perfect fit for the company, we think you're really smart because you've gone to MIT, you've done a great job in grad school. If you bomb the cases, it's a non-starter. So I think that's a huge thing to recognize. You can't just go into the interviews without having sort of prepared for them. The second component, in addition to things that will be unique for any company, I think is communication. So because what we do is so focused not only on being good problem solvers, but being able to tell that story, deliver the message to your client, and to help your client deliver the message to the people he works with, we need people who can not only do the analysis, but be fluent and conversant and great communicators. So even with all the things that will be different from consulting firm to consulting firm, I think those are two things that are pretty universal across most interview processes. Yeah, I mean, in my case, probably in all of our cases, they're very different. So, you know, if I think about being at the bench, thinking about designing an experiment, or for those of us in the life sciences, thinking about a molecular pathway, it's a very different feel from what we're doing, where the problems are ultimately business related. So now they're still going to be informed by in some cases the science, in some cases by what's going on in the clinic for those of us doing life science work. It's a very different type of problem solving. It still is fundamentally problem solving, but the answer is not how to design an experiment. It becomes much more about sort of a clear, defined answer that is going to help your client make a decision. So, you know, I think a lot of consulting firms that are business and strategy related, as an example, think about forecasting. So what is the opportunity associated with, you know, a certain disease area or a certain product? And so that has a very different feel relative to what I think most of us are doing on sort of a day-to-day basis. Now again, the types of problems, in my experience, change at every project. So, you know, what's hard depends on the question being asked, the area that you're looking at. So, you know, and for even those of us who are in life science consulting and are a little bit closer to the content, even on projects that might have more of a scientific bent, I think they're more focused on thinking about feasibility. So is this something that can be developed? Or even if it's going to be really in the weeds, so what's the best way to tackle this disease area? We'll never know it down to that same level of detail that you would see in the lab. It's sort of going to be a step higher in terms of knowing the literature that's out there and being able to sort of make a recommendation.
Going back to something I mentioned earlier, the ambiguity of the problem solving is a big difference between academia or research-based problem solving and consulting problem solving. So, you know, day-to-day research, over the course of a PhD, very few of us start out doing a project that we actually end up writing our thesis on. Of course, that timeline is shortened for a consulting project, but from day one, there's a very clear approach to doing that, even if we may not necessarily know what the strategic recommendation is at the end, but you have all of this data and you have all of this information, and from a PhD perspective or a postdoc perspective, it's presenting that in a paper, it's presenting that at a conference, and you're very much still on the factual level of the information. In consulting, you really have to raise the bar and take it to the next level. What does that mean then? What does that mean from a strategy? Should our client focus on oncology, or should our client focus on I don't know, ophthalmology, to pick another therapeutic area? It becomes a much bigger picture question as opposed to the next immediate conclusion that you might be able to make from the immediate results of a experiment.
One last thing I think I would add to that, one difference that I found, so when you're testing a hypothesis in the lab, you're sort of on the hook for generating the data, and you can generate that data. I think that is one other difference that I've seen where, you know, I'd say our work is still hypothesis driven, but depending on your question, sometimes there's data gaps that exist and there's no way to fill them. So part of it is making the best assumptions, giving all the data that's out there, which I think is a little bit of a difference where you can't always find or generate the data that would answer that question. You have to be smart about assumptions that get you to the right answer in the end.
So we have time for maybe one more question?
So if you think back when you started working as a consultant and all the possibilities and the resources you had in work with your PhD, what do you think would be like important for a PhD student to try in terms of classes, projects, internships, seminars to follow, things like that, to actually be prepared one day to go into consulting work?
So, I think that's one of the great things about MIT, at least for the things that our company looks for. There's a lot of ways you can get involved in terms of thinking about consulting. So, things that I think are really helpful, there's consulting clubs here, and for those of you, if any of you are affiliated with Harvard, I think Harvard has one. I think it's a great way to start to understand cases, to learn what consulting is about. I took classes at Sloan, which I thought were very eye-opening and enlightening. So there are classes that were healthcare focused, so it was my interest. And I think there are lots of industry-specific opportunities at Sloan. And that's a way to start, without having to get an MBA, to start thinking about the business of whatever science or industry you guys are particularly interested in. And I know, so for the application process, we consider everybody, but those people who have made it clear that they're interested in the business of whatever their science might be, I think that provides a bit of an advantage. So, and what goes hand in hand with that, again, practicing cases, things that you can get through things like the consulting clubs.
I would say do what you're passionate about. Let that be your guiding principle. And if after 5 years of grad school you look back and you haven't taken a business class and you haven't gone and worked at a company or anything, you're probably not all that passionate about it. You have to be, as we've discussed, being in consulting is just as tough as being in academia. So if you're not passionate about the work, it's not going to work out very well. So, do that first, and then, there are people who later in life figure out that they, want to go into consulting, but the vast majority of people who are successful in consulting realized early in life, not necessarily that they wanted to be a consultant, but they were interested in the commercialization of technology, or they were interested in the way that companies work operationally, those sorts of things.
And just being aware of the latest news or the newest happenings, developments in your field of interest, be it energy, healthcare, or whatever, being able to demonstrate that interest and that curiosity during the course of talking to any employer, I think would be a definite plus for you. Shows that you're thinking outside of just the day-to-day work of going into lab and checking off some boxes and doing an experiment and writing a paper, but you're actually trying to place that in the context of the world around you. What does it mean? What do I actually want to do? And that level of curiosity is helpful in any career, and is certainly something that we will look for in successful consultants.
One very easy thing, if you guys haven't done it yet, think about what your research means, take it one step further. So with what you're doing now, what does that mean in terms of commercializing it, the impact that it has more broadly? Those are the types of things to be thinking about. So, it doesn't just end with the paper, but what would that mean for taking the next steps for developing a drug, developing a technology? So very easy thing to do, and probably a question you'll get if you guys decide to interview at consulting firms.
All right, if you guys have additional questions, you should feel free to come down and chat with us. If you guys are joining me and thanking them.